Hi, I'm Natalie Pregibon, and I'm the Director of P3 Intelligence at Concordia. Here with me today, I have founder and president of the Eurasia Group, Dr. Ian Bremmer.
Hi.
Ian, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So you just recently joined the Concordia Leadership Council. So what first interested you in Concordia, and what sort of spurred you to become a member of the Leadership Council?
I think there are two things. They're very much aligned with each other. One is that the agenda of Concordia, it's very much nonpartisan, which is very important to me. It's very analytic focused. It wants to understand the world. But it also is trying to advance something which I think is very important. It's certainly the way the world's going to go in the future, which is bringing together the public and the private sector. There's a lot of overlap today between the public and the private sector. Globalization is increasingly not just being driven by multinational corporations. They're not just growing and becoming the only actors that matter, as a lot of people thought. In the decades following the World War II, it's much more complicated world, and it's one where we have to learn how to bridge these two very different types of organizations. And there are very few folks that are really committed to that. So I like that as a political science matters to me. But the second reason, which is easily as important, is that I think the folks that run the organization are legitimate folks with great integrity, great energy. I like them. I don't spend time with people that I don't like. So, those would be the two reasons that I would have gotten involved.
Sure. And as you know, Concordia sort of focuses both its activities on two main things, and that's the convening arm as well as the research arm. And so how do you see the intersection of both convening and research putting Concordia in a unique position that perhaps other organizations might not have?
Well, if you research and you don't convene, then nobody hears about your research. If you convene and you don't research, then you are not convening very much. And people do one or the other. I mean, look, I'm about to go to the World Economic Forum in Davos, and it is the world's most extraordinary convener. And because it's so amazing, people come and they fill it with their own agenda. But there are very few people with that kind of convening power. The reality is that there are massive numbers of research institutions out there that are fighting for very limited bandwidth. And an issue will pop, a great piece, you can work years on a study, and then it's forgotten. And I think if you don't marry the ability to do credible, important research with the capacity to actually get it in the hands of people that can make a difference and have them talk about it, then you're not accomplishing very much, you're not doing very much. I mean, I'm a political scientist, and I started in academia. And the reason I didn't stay an academic is precisely because I wasn't interested in spending a lot of time writing things that nobody was going to pay attention to. I'm not prepared to be irrelevant and merely interesting. I want to make a difference. We all do. And I think that's something that the good folks at Concordia are trying to work pretty hard to make a difference in.
And you've actually attended our summits, and you spoke at the last one a little bit about political risk. And have you seen it as a good forum of actually, bringing that research to light and bringing together people who are coming from these different sectors and perhaps don't know the value that each can give the other?
No, I've spoken at a couple of them now, and I think that putting the people in the room is great. But if you aren't doing it with a message and with research that actually will force a conversation that is yours, that they'll end up moving to the lowest common denominator, which is I'm here in New York and there's someone I can do business with, and let me talk about why I'm going to do business with them. So everyone wants to network, but if you really want a message to move, you have to force it. And so I think what I've liked about the summits that I've attended is that you're actually giving these people pretty direct marching orders. We're not going to tell you what your position should be, but we are going to tell you this is what we want you to talk about. It's an undercovered issue. It's one we know is going to be more important, and we're going to have thought leaders, public thought leaders that are really recognized, whether it's President Clinton or whether it's Senator John McCain or whether it's Ian Bremmer. We're going to put you in front of you, and they're going to address these issues, and you're going to have to deal with it. So, it's a big topic. It takes a long time to move people in this direction, but certainly we're contributing to awareness, and hopefully it's actually starting to make it a dialogue.
Right. And so one of the things that we released at this last summit in September was the Concordia Index, which ranks countries based on their readiness as well as their need to engage in these public-private partnerships. So how do you see a tool like that, which aggregates a lot of data that's sometimes difficult to find and bring together, how do you see that being used by governments and businesses and nonprofits?
Well, some countries will like it and some won't, right? Whenever you create a list, you've got people that want to game it and want to find a way to make sure they're on top. I mean, there's always the concern that, look, everyone thinks they're above average. It's the Lake Wobegon principle applied to indices. We've done an index on political risk for 15 years now. It's the same sort of issue. You got to get beyond that and say, I don't care. I think the fact that Eurasia Group doesn't take money from governments without rule of law, Concordia Summit doesn't either. You have to have the ability to credibly say, look, this is here. We'll let you under the hood. This is the methodology. This is the way we collect data. Anyone can look at it. Anyone can understand it. Our interest is in providing something that everyone can digest and say, wow, you want to do well on this because it's going to make it easier for you to attract investment. It's going to make multinational corporations more interested in working with your governments to engage in projects X, Y, and Z. Harder to read reports. Easier to deal with lists and numbers. Yes, it's an oversimplification. No, that's not the first and last stop you need to go, but it's an entry point, and it's something that people can then say, aha, why is it that I should be looking at Brazil and not Nigeria? And I think that's useful.
Right, and then we're trying right now to build more contextual pieces, so case studies that then look at the individual reasons of why a country scores where it does.
That's right.
Which I think is helpful. So turning generally to partnerships, what do you see as kind of success factors in a good partnership? And are they the same country to country? Do they differ according to sectors? What's the recipe for a good partnership?
One recipe. I think there's one recipe for a good partnership that doesn't matter what sector or what country you're in, and that means that both actors actually have to have a willingness to understand what the other actor is getting out of it. That's true of a partnership between two people. It's true of a partnership between two entities. And particularly when we're talking about different kinds of entities, one of which is going to be focused much more by a profit motive, the other of which is going to be focused much more by a political stability, security, and maybe even an individual stability and security perspective. The ability to presume that, oh, I'm going to make a lot of money for these people. They must want that too. Or, oh, this is doing well for the country, so the other countries want. There has to be a willingness of both parties to get together and say, why do you, I know what I'm getting out of this. Why are you getting something out of this? Because I've never dealt with you in this way before. We've never established this kind of a joint venture. What is it that makes you want to stay? Because those things can change over time, and what makes a deal attractive to someone in day one can be different. If you don't understand the motivations, you're not going to know what your red lines are. That could take what looks like a good deal and something that's a disaster, right? It happens all the time. People don't like to look at other folks' assumptions. They like to just assume that my assumptions are yours. They work the same way. So I think that's the single most important thing. There's absolutely questions of relative competence and capacity. There's bandwidth issues, folks that really want to get the deal done, but the fact is that there's only one good person in the ministry and everybody else underneath them is overwhelmed or corrupt or what have you. So there's issue of technocrats and education. There's also, do they have the power to get something done, or does it really sit someplace else no matter what they say? Are there institutional hurdles that they don't tell you about? As a company, actually a partnership, and it doesn't matter if the person you're talking to seems really important, but actually they can't get it done for another 2 years. All of those things are important, but all of them end up coming down to how much does each party understand the motivations of the other.
And the transparency.
The capacity, the motivations, the limitations, the constraints. I mean, what are the things that party doesn't like? Everyone also likes to be optimistic when they get into a deal. Yes, it's going to work. People generally believe that things that they're trying are going to succeed. And you're much more likely to have them succeed if you understand what are the things that would make them fail. People don't frequently like to look at those things.
Yeah. So that's something that stakeholders perhaps overlook. And that's one of the barriers of not seeing what the other person is actually getting out of it. So how closely do you actually think that, whether a country is good for public-private partnerships mimics whether or not it's good for just general investment for profit? Is one correlated with the other? Is it a good indication if generally, growth is high in this country, we want to invest, and not work directly with the government? Are those two countries similar, or?
Well, certainly North Korea is bad at both. right? I mean, we don't want to invest there. We don't want to partner with their government. The most corrupt, the most, appalling totalitarian, authoritarian regimes are places that generally you want to stay away from. They're unstable, they're brittle, they're opaque. You might be able to make a lot of money in a short period of time. They might take everything away from you immediately, never mind the human rights and other implications that come with that. Once you get beyond that, thankfully, relatively small number of countries, the factors are actually very different because, in lots of places, what you want to invest in a private sector environment is you want rule of law, you want relative transparency, and frequently you want the government to stay out of your way. All right. Certainly, that's the view of folks in the United States. I mean, multinational corporations will tell you all over the place, look, we think the U.S. is a good market, just don't screw us up. Right? Congress, don't get in our way. Yeah, we'd love it if we can capture the regulatory process and put a lot of money into lobbying and make you write a regulation that is exactly what we want, because corporations don't want competition, they want monopolies, right? But if we can't have that, what we'd really like is for you to just stay out. Well, in a public-private partnership, it's exactly the opposite of that, right? You actually need a government partner that is capable and proactive and will work with you. That is radically different than a place that you just want to do private sector investment. You suddenly need to understand not what's the propensity to intervene, but you need to know how capable these people are. Can they get it done? What do they want to make money? Do they mind if you make money? And what happens if you, in some cases in court, you look at governments around the world, and if you do too well, that can be a problem for their local constituencies. Well, that's not true in a corporate relationship. You want to do a JV, you both want to maximize profitability. I mean, fundamentally, political risk is about political outcomes that can be very rational for a political actor, but they lead to very different outcomes than you would have expected if folks are just looking to maximize profitability, even long-term profitability. And that is precisely what makes a public-private partnership so interesting and so challenging, is that political risk is fundamental to it. If you don't get the political motivations, then corporations, which, sort of in principle are not supposed to be driven by that. In fact, their shareholders absolutely, that would undermine their entire raison d'etre, are pushing them in a very different direction. So it really is very different sets of things that motivate you to want to invest in one or the other.
Sure. And looking, nowadays at the debt that so many nations are under, how do you see sort of private sector intervention happening, and do you see the private sector as becoming more involved with what typically was delivered by the public sector?
Yeah, of course I do. And I see that happening not only in developing markets, but in developed markets too. I mean, the United States, roughly 20% of land in the U.S. is owned by the U.S. government. About 1 million buildings in the U.S. are owned by the U.S. government. Debt is high in the United States. We now have a sequester. We have a debt limit issue. And demographics are going to make that more challenging over time. There's clearly going to be an interest to unlock more private sector potential as a possibility to help the United States grow and grow for everybody, as opposed to growing for a relatively small percentage of Americans. That's more clear in emerging markets where growth has slowed. And where the need to build out infrastructure quickly is very significant. You look at, the entirety of sub-Saharan Africa, you have over 1 billion people on the continent, and they're 50% urbanized, and women are getting educated, and health is improving, and demographics are getting more sustainable, but the governments can't make this work. And now they can do government-to-government partnerships. They can work with China, and the Chinese will come in, but there are limitations in that regard. There are technology limitations, there are management limitations, and also the fact that the Chinese also want to bring their own labor. They want to take out, sort of as much food as possible and resources possible and bring it out. Frequently, public-private partnerships make a lot more sense in countries like that. So clearly, this is an environment where this is going to be more important. But it's not only because of debt. It's also because you are entering a world where the public sector matters more, right? I mean, as emerging markets become now 50% of global output, 70% of global growth, the fact is these are countries where states are more important. They're countries where state-owned enterprises are larger. It's not just China, where the state-owned enterprises are more than 50% of GDP. It's places like Colombia and Brazil and India and Hungary and Poland, where they are very large percentages still. And that means that if you want to do meaningful business in those countries, you're going to run up against state-owned enterprises and privately owned national champions in a real way. trade. We talk about public-private partnerships as if it's a private entity and a state entity, but the fact is, if it's a private entity and another private entity that is informally linked to the state, it is effectively a public-private partnership, right? So, in all of these environments, you're going to have to bring these methodologies into place.
Sure. And going back to sort of the emerging countries that, are having, perhaps the growth has slowed a little now,
Yeah.
but we're experiencing a lot of growth and a
Right.
lot of opportunity for return on investment. And these are the same countries, though, that are more politically unstable.
Right.
So how do you weigh the risks and the rewards of a situation like that, of when to go in versus when perhaps to stay back?
Well, there's one point that makes it impossible to answer that question, which is that you need to understand what the risk appetite is of the individual or the corporation or the entity that's making the investment. And that is radically different for certain people and others. I mean, I might tell you that I'd never put money directly into an African equity fund because I'm very cautious and with downside. Other people are very different. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday who runs a very large hedge fund. And he has this little exercise that he does within his firm where he asks different people, okay, if I were to tell you that I'm going to give you a coin flip and the 60% likelihood it's going to come up heads, right? So 60% chance you're going to win. How much of your money would you be willing to bet on that, right? And then I said, what if it was 80%? What if it was 99%? What if you knew that with 99% certainty you were going to win? How much of your total net worth would you be willing to bet? And what's interesting is even in a hedge fund, where people make those kind of bets all the time, the relative risk acceptance of those individuals is all over the map. You'll have some people that'll say, I will take 50% of my net worth and put it on a 99% win. You'll have other people that'll put 5%. And they're both people. So you ask me the question of what makes it likely that you're willing to take that risk. The first thing I want to do is say, well, who's the person? Mm-hmm. What's the entity you're talking about? And this gets back to the point of what is the motivation of the. Is this someone who understands that they're taking 20 different bets, and it's okay if 18 of them don't pan out because they're very risk acceptant? Or are they betting the farm on this, and therefore they are there no matter what, how long, no matter how badly you squeeze them, which may incent the government to actually make it much harder on them once they get in. You need to know those things, and you need to be aware of that for both sides as you come in. Those are critical points. I mean, we can talk about, oh, this country's too risky, this sector's too risky. We can talk about some of the metrics that would make a country score about well or not as well on the Concordia Index, and we could talk about the things that make political risk more problematic, the relative instability of leaders or the lack of legitimacy and consolidation of institutions, the lack of rule of law. All of these things are important, but none of them by themselves give the answer to your question. Yeah.
And so speaking of risk aversion,
Yeah.
your group, the Eurasia group, just released the top risks for 2014.
Yes, we did.
And a lot of index countries made that list.
Sure.
And I think number 2 perhaps was emerging markets, or as you called them,
Diverging
markets, which were all index countries, and they are holding elections for in 2014.
Yeah.
So how do you see the outcomes of those elections? I know they're going to be very different in different countries. How do you see that affecting the international dynamic for 2014?
Well, I mean, incumbents are going to win, and there are in many places incumbents that have been in place for a long, long time. This is true for whether it's the AK party in Turkey or whether it's Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. India is the one place where you're going to see significant, sort of turnover as the Congress party loses and the BJP and a bunch of others probably come in. So generally speaking, it's a relatively politically stable period, but it's a political stable period at the same time that you have constituents that are wealthier and have much greater demands on their governments, which mean they don't just want jobs. They want better services. They want more security. They want better infrastructure, things that are hard for governments to provide. And that's making the relative quality of governance in these countries much more important to outcomes. So you have to look much more carefully at which of these governments can get it done, which ones can't. Coming out of these elections, emerging markets are going to have radically different trajectories. Colombia looks really good. Indonesia looks pretty good. Turkey looks really bad. India looks pretty bad. Especially in an environment where interest rates are probably going up, where sort of we're moving from quantitative easing to a taper, and in an environment where it's the gap between developed market growth rates and emerging market growth rates are actually smaller. people are going to be much more careful about not saying, I want to put money into the emerging market space. They're going to say, I really need to pick and choose. Another reason why it's really important to look at the relative index positions of all of these countries, right? Because they're going to broaden out a lot more than they would have been 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
So speaking of energy increases, Iran was another, the accord with Iran was another big thing in 2013 that's now come through to 2014, and we're looking at perhaps some sort of temporary freeze on the nuclear program starting on Monday.
Yeah.
How likely do you think a actual temporary agreement is, or perhaps even a long-term agreement?
Temporary agreement's almost 100%. It's I think it's pretty much in place. And as I'm going to Davos, and President Rouhani is going to be there. He wouldn't be showing up if he didn't have something good to say. He's looking to tell people Iran's open for business. Come on, let's go. I mean, I'm sure there'll be a little great Satan thrown in there someplace, but generally, no, they have to do that. For domestic purposes, they have to show that they're being hard while they're cutting a deal, right? I mean, they have to be a bit of an only Nixon can go to China, because, I mean, otherwise they're going to undermine themselves internally with hardliners that actually matter. So I'm sympathetic. I'm empathetic to that reality. Again, understand what motivates the person you're trying to do business with, whatever that means, whether you like them or you don't like them. It's still good to know. But the deal is going to happen. This interim deal is not much of a deal. So the Iranians are destroying some stockpiles, and they're stopping with sort of advanced uranium production enrichment, and in return they are getting some very limited sanctions reductions that is going to throw a few $1 billion in their pockets. This is not the end of sanctions. It's not the significant reduction of sanctions. The Iranians have a good 1.5 million barrels a day of oil they'd like to produce that they're not going to be able to. Their economy's been crushed by sanctions. That doesn't change particularly over the course of the next 6 months. This is a bit of a reprieve. It's a loosening of the necktie to give folks enough time to rolling up the sleeves so they can get to work. That's all it is, right? And hopefully, in 6 months' time, we've got a shot at a real deal. 6 months is not a lot of time. It's going to go quickly. And there are a lot of people that don't want this deal to happen. The Saudis, for example. Congress is very skeptical. The Israelis are very skeptical. And there are some in Iran that are very skeptical. So, look, I think this could happen. On balance, I'm a little more optimistic than not. I'm thinking, 60% shot we actually get this done. But how much of my net wealth am I willing to bet on a 60% coin flip? 1%, right? Not that much. It could go either way. And if it doesn't happen, we've got serious problems. The Saudis are going to go nuclear. There's a potential for military strikes. It's going to fragment. If it does happen, oil prices are going way down. That's also a risk. Oil prices go way down. The Saudis are in real trouble. And so are the Venezuelans, and so are Nigerians, and so are the Russians. So this is a very interesting period for Iran and for the world around Iran. This is all going to happen this year. It doesn't wait till 2015. One way or the other, it's getting done. The last few years, it's been sanctions going up, and the Iranians keep building, and we're kicking the can down the road. Okay, the road ends in 2014. So one way or the other, we're going to find out what happens. Pretty interesting.
All right, well, we'll all look forward to seeing what happens.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you very much,
My
Dr.
pleasure.
Bremmer.
Sure.
It was wonderful having you here today.
Great.